Muy bien, vamos a continuar con la siguiente presentación de un experto mundialmente conocido. Tenemos aquí el gran placer y el honor de presentar al profesor Douglas Bausch. El Doug Bausch, como le llaman, ayuda a administrar el programa HASUS de FEMA, que proporciona métodos estandarizados para estimar pérdidas por terremotos, inundaciones, tsunamis y huracanes. DAC supervisa el desarrollo de métodos de evaluación de riesgos para el programa HASUS, así como la planificación de futuras mejoras y el desarrollo de herramientas externas. DAC estuvo en la región 8 de la FEMA durante 14 años, donde ayudó a implementar el NHGRP HASUS y proporcionó modelos y análisis nacionales para la agencia. El señor Bausch tiene más de 25 años de experiencia ayudando a estados comunidades en los Estados Unidos y en el extranjero en el desarrollo de evaluaciones sólidas de riesgo y vulnerabilidad para respaldar la respuesta a todos los peligros, la mitigación, la recuperación y planificación de preparación. Fue reconocido como uno de los principales expertos en la materia FEMA en análisis de riesgos y modelado de pérdidas y fue líder del grupo de trabajo de modelado de FEMA que apoyó directamente al Centro Nacional de Coordinación de Respuesta, el NRCC, para eventos de nivel 1 de FEMA a proporcionar análisis de riesgo rápidos en apoyo de conciencia de la resolución y ejecución de programas para casos de desastres. With this introduction about your doing and being, Mr. Bausch, we are very happy. We are really extremely proud to have you here in our presentation card of our new center, our new research center, CERAM, which is established now in Quito in our University of the Armed Forces, where I'm professor. Please, the audience is with you. You can continue.
Okay, I believe I'm unmuted and my you can see my screen. Please let me know if not. I think I appreciate the introduction. I'm hoping it's okay to present in English. I do really, I'm excited about this opportunity. As you heard in my introduction, our main role, or my main role here is I help FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the US. We have a team that provides all of the operations and maintenance, the training, the help desk for the FEMA HAZUS software. And it stood for Hazards United States, but we started describing it in lowercase because we have a lot of international applications as well. The methodologies, the training materials, the technical manuals can be used throughout the world for several perils, and then they are. Today, I'm mostly going to talk about applying the tsunami loss model in Hawaii, which you heard from my introduction is also where I live. And so we'll start with an overview of what HAZUS is. We'll include just at a high level the tsunami loss model approach and the methodologies. And then we'll talk about how we have both distant and local tsunami sources here in Hawaii. And we'll talk about the modeling that we've done for those and the approach for losses and how we're applying the losses that are both economic and social. So in the case of the tsunami model, we have a casualty methodology, and we also have a building loss methodology. And so using that economic impact information, you can use that to drive decision support, political decisions for projects that might be installing signage, sirens, exercises, educational opportunities. And then very importantly in Waikiki is an area where we have as many as 300,000 people exposed to the tsunami threat. And we don't think we'll have time to evacuate that whole area. So vertical evacuation is a very important parameter in that area. But we'll also talk about the results. And fundamentally, one of the best things that we can do in the HAZUS program is that we can take scientific information about threats and hazards and communicate those in ways that people understand in terms of economic losses and social impacts, displaced households, shelter needs, we estimate debris. So basically what we can do is take difficult to understand scientific information and hopefully translate that into dollars and those social impacts that everybody understands. In terms of what we do, it's physical damage to buildings. So immediately after an earthquake, a flood, a tsunami, a hurricane, we provide data that shows how many buildings might be destroyed, major damage, minor damage, affected. And that information really helps speed the response and recovery. And as I mentioned too, this information doesn't have to wait for the event to occur. So cost effectiveness is a big application that we do. So in terms of figuring out what are good strategies for reducing future impacts in terms of what's often used in terms of support building codes. So with and without different building codes adopted, with and without different land use decisions. So being able to provide the economic change based on that can help support that decision. And then in terms of social impacts, casualties and shelter needs are very important post-event. What I'll also talk about is how HAZUS in our Hawaii project was also very multidisciplinary. It's not just me running the model and providing the results, but we work with scientists to get the information on the tsunami hazards. In terms of modeling for distant tsunamis and local tsunamis, I'll show some examples of that later in the presentation. And then we work very extensively with the engineering communities in terms of developing potential damage functions. And in tsunami, we have the threat from inundation, but we also have the threat from the velocity of the wave. And when you get into designing buildings for vertical evacuation, resistant construction, you need to know more than just the run-up. You want to know more about the velocity of that potential tsunami impact. So I'll show some examples of how we work with that and how we apply that. The other big application is obviously translating our information to policymakers. So we've worked closely with the Hawaii State Emergency Management. We've been supporting them in terms of grant applications. So in the US, local and state agencies apply to the federal agencies for grants to do things, to mitigate tsunami hazards, to mitigate earthquake hazards, to mitigate wind hazards. And in order to have a successful grant, you need to be able to demonstrate that risk and show what kind of impact you're going to make for the grant in terms of reducing costs for future events. So those policy decisions are very important. And we also do a lot with mitigation planners, land use planners, in terms of providing the data and showing the areas that are most at risk. With all the perils and hazards, and in any risk assessment, there's three really equally important areas to concentrate in to address in order to have a good model, and that's our inventory. That's our inventory data. So in HAZUS, we benefit a lot from other agencies collecting data on our built environment. So the U.S. Census, there's a lot of commercial companies that collect real estate data. So we're using all of this data and we're bringing it together in a baseline inventory to support our loss modeling. What's very important for tsunami, though, is that inventory information really needed to be site specific. We did a lot of work with aggregated data, over a census block or census tract or over a region, and that's been very useful. We could area weight that and use GIS methods to improve it, but because tsunami hazard information changes so locally, within a few meters, a few feet, the velocity, the depth can change dramatically. So for our tsunami methodology, our tsunami model, we've moved to a site-specific inventory. And so that's where we have a point on structure. Hazard data for tsunami is also very critical. And as I mentioned, knowing the depth of run-up, or the height of run-up, subtracting the digital elevation model, that gives us one parameter, that gives us the depth. But the velocity data is also very important for us for tsunami. And then we work closely with the engineering community, as I mentioned, for damage functions. And in the tsunami methodology, we have damage functions that are related to what we call 36 model building types. These model building types are common in the US, but they're also common internationally. You have different masonry types, a broad variety of wood frame types. And then we also have them considered at 7 different seismic design levels, ranging all the way from pre-code, our older buildings in the United States that weren't built to code, to our most modern code. So these 7 different design levels all have damage functions, fragility functions available for them in our hazardous library. In terms of potential impacts, these little icons represent our 4 perils. So the earthquake, flood, hurricane, and in blue highlighted is our tsunami icon. And we provide potential impact information for economic losses, building damage, shelter and evacuation needs, and casualties in our tsunami model today. The tsunami model, as I mentioned, the methodology can be applied globally, anywhere in the world. However, in the US, we've developed the inventory data, and we provide the capability out of the box. And you can download from FEMA's website and begin to run for the tsunami model for our 5 very high hazard states. So Hawaii, California, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska, which all have a history of significant tsunami events, as well as 5 US territories. So we have data for the Pacific territories that are threatened by tsunami, as well as Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands in the Caribbean. So the tsunami model and hazards today support that out of the box methodology and data. We also have methodology differences between a near and distant sources. As you're all aware of, a near source has earthquake ground shaking combined with it. So our methodology will actually combine the damage due to earthquake ground shaking and the damage due to tsunami inundation at the structural level. And so we combine the probability of earthquake damage with the probability of tsunami damage in every structure. And then recompute the losses that are based on those. Another important parameter in local near source tsunamis, especially big subduction zone events, is working with a post-event digital elevation model. That is the new elevation after the event. So that's been very important for us. And then in a local tsunami too, you also have issues. Well, the main issue is the high fatalities related to inundation and trying to get out of harm's way. And I'll talk about that methodology a little bit more. And then of course, a distant source tsunami methodology. This is where we don't have it combined with ground shaking losses, but we don't have the ground shaking that provides the potential for warnings. So what we have to do is rely on warnings from our NOAA, our National Weather Service. We have 2 main tsunami warning centers, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center here on Hawaii, and then the National Tsunami Warning Center up in Alaska that provides warning for the rest of the US. So we rely on these warning centers to give us the parameters that we need for modeling and hopefully save us from future events. This is a picture of Hawaii, Waikiki, and that's Diamond Head. that you see there. That volcanic crater is called Diamond Head on the island of Oahu. Our data, as I mentioned, for tsunami loss modeling is at the structure level. It's called our National Structure Inventory. FEMA worked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to develop this for the nation, and it provides structure points that include data on the size, structure, the value, the building value, as well as the content value, occupancy type information, whether or not it's residential, commercial, industrial. Because a lot is based on that, a lot in terms of how valuable the structure is. You know, so if it's a hospital, it's much more expensive to replace than a single family residence, for example. This data also includes estimates of day and night population and estimates of the over and under age 65 population. And that's because we use different pedestrian walking speeds for under and over age 65. And then there's big swings, especially in coastal areas, between our daytime and our nighttime population. So this data are important in terms of scenarios, and our losses can swing greatly, whether or not it's a daytime scenario or a nighttime scenario. Another important point is that all of our models also have the data for user-defined facilities. Let's say you have, 100 facilities that you want to look at. You could bring those into the model, either using the CIS tools or a tool that we have called the Comprehensive Data Management System, or CDMS. And the advantage for Tsunami is that we didn't develop or require additional attributes for structures with Tsunami. That is, we leverage the existing vulnerability attributes for that were already there for earthquake and that were already there for flood. So earthquake, our tsunami fragility functions are based on earthquake building type and design level. And then our height or the height and structure of the run-up is related to the first floor height data that we were already collecting for our flood loss modeling. So that was a nice thing. We didn't actually require that the user do anything in addition to get additional attributes for tsunami. Hazard input I want to talk about a little bit. We support different levels of analysis. Out of the box, we have the capability to use a digital elevation model and a single run-up to provide a threat in terms of run-up. So our level 1 methodologies are where only run-up information or depth of water is available, and we use an empirical function that is used extensively in the building code community to estimate velocity from that run-up. And that empirical function is not as good as actually having velocity coming out of our tsunami models, but it is a good approximation based on depth and a sound approach. But our level 2 and level 3 require that the user, in addition to bringing in their depth or run-up information, also brings in that velocity information. And I'll show some examples where that varies, or where that can vary significantly. This is Waikiki. This is on the island of Oahu. This isn't the area I mentioned that, maybe as many as 200,000 people are exposed to the tsunami threat. Depending on the warning time, we may not have enough time to get everybody out of harm's way. So you can see with this velocity information that the velocity gets concentrated up channels, around buildings, structures. There are localized areas where velocities are very, very high. And we need to consider that when we design buildings in those areas for vertical evacuation. We have a general rule of thumb of 4 and 10 in Waikiki. That is that you evacuate to buildings that are at least 10 stories or higher, and you get in the 4th floor or higher of those buildings. And that's a way that we can get a lot of people out of harm's way a lot more quickly than trying to get all the way out to high ground. because these areas are very, very, are very, very highly populated, and traffic is kind of a nightmare in those areas. So very difficult to get out. But these data are used in our from American Society of Civil Engineers and others. This is a screenshot of our interface to add the hazard data. As you can see, the level 1, if you have just a single run-up, you can run losses and provide losses, but the quality of your results improves based on the quality and level of the data that you bring into the model. I'm going to get into the casualty methodology just at a high level and talk about a couple of key parameters. We also provide casualty results, what we call level 1 and level 2. Level 1 is basically what we call our roads only approach. And that assumes that everybody walking out of harm's way or getting out of harm's way are taking roads or the road network. Often that's not the fastest way to get out of an area. But the problem is with level 2 input, if you use land use, if you use imagery, you may include areas where they're impassable. Let's say there's a barbed wire fence or some kind of obstruction. You won't see that in your land use data unless you go in and start to inspect it. You may need to go into the field and look at some critical areas. So that's called our level 2. That's when you can bring in land use data and people take the shortest way out. But our level 1 uses the road network. Another key parameter in our input is where fatality rates greatly increase, and that's where water depth is over 2 meters. So we use a much higher fatality rate when water depth is over 2 meters. So in order to do that, we calculate the time it takes to get to what's called partial safety, the less than 2 meter depth, and to full safety, which is out of the area of inundation. So we project and calculate the time to get out of both of those. A couple other quick things in terms of casualty time parameters. Of course, warning time is very critical, and arrival time for that first wave. But we also use time to maximum run-up, because once the wave attacks the beach, things like the reaction time of the community is no longer that important. They're all reacting at the same speed. So I'll talk in a minute about our kind of community preparedness levels and how we consider those. But once the wave has attacked the beach, once the wave has arrived, those community preparedness levels are no longer used. So that time to maximum run-up gives us a different variable to use. So very important in casualty modeling is what we consider preparedness level of the community. And we use our results to both advocate and support mitigation measures in communities to do better at preparedness, to make sure that they have sirens, to make sure that they exercise, to make sure that they have education, make sure that they have education programs. And we provide our losses at 3 different community preparedness levels, what we consider good, fair, and poor. And what I'm showing in this graphic is called a probability distribution function. So the values that are in the methodology is the median of that distribution function and the standard deviation. So what that median means is that at the good level is we think that half the community has reacted and half the community has not reacted yet. And this steps all the way down to the poor level. These have default values, which users can change and edit based on local studies or better or local information from social scientists. But the defaults out of the box provide results for these 3 general categories. And this is not about how long it takes to walk out of an area or get out of an area physically. This is more about reacting to that warning. So instead of instead of the time to walk from your home to safety, it's the time to get your shoes on and get out the door and start walking to safety. So this is more about reaction time than it is about physically how long it takes to get from point A to point B. This example is more about physically how long it takes to get from point A to point B. This is our level 1 analysis on the North Shore of Oahu. In this in terms of the red, those are areas where it takes over half an hour to walk from your structure to high ground, based on different pedestrian evacuation times. And as I mentioned, we do it for over and under age 65. We do it for night and day populations. We also do it for, as I mentioned, to get to partial safety, to get to where it's 2 meters or less, and then get to full safety. So maps like this and data like this provide the data that the community could use to locate signage, concentrate in terms of education, just in general identify problem areas where evacuations might take longer. And so that's provided by these maps. What our output provides is for every census block, a probability of casualties, the ability to survive, reduce injuries, and reduce fatalities. And it considers both, as I mentioned, the warning and reaction time. So as you improve our warning and reaction time parameters, those rates go up. This tab shows the good rate. We also, as I mentioned, air and poor are also provided. So this gets us to the probability of casualties. So now I want to talk a little bit more about our detailed study that we did in Hawaii. And our first step for this detailed study in Hawaii was to improve the inventory data. We were lucky in Hawaii, we had a study that was done for sea level rise, and that produced very good high resolution building data in our most vulnerable areas. This sea level rise, or the area impacted by sea level rise, is much smaller than the area that could be impacted by a tsunami. So we had to take that sea level rise data, and we benefited from that, but we expanded it and incorporated a new version of the Army Corps of Engineers National Structure Inventory and tax assessor data that we have from our local municipalities. So we spent a lot of time on improving that inventory. But as I mentioned, of the 3 big components we need for loss modeling, inventory, hazard, and damage functions, you need to equalize your time. And so you also need to spend time on making sure you have good hazard data. In Hawaii, we've had 2 major efforts in terms of mapping. The first effort was before the 2011 Tohoku tsunami. And our lessons for the 2011 Tohoku tsunami was that you can have an event that's worse than the historic record. So up until Tohoku, we were basing our evacuations on the historic record. We went back 200 years, we mapped the maximum run-up. What's very curious in Hawaii, though, is that of the 5 worst events in the last 200 years, they all occurred within just an 18-year time frame from 1946 to 1964. And so that's very unique. It's very hard for us to then take what we consider maybe a 200-year record and translate that into a return interval. So we've taken a stab at that, and I'll talk about that later. After we did the standard evacuation zone in 2011, we started to look around the whole Pacific and all the potential worst threat events and develop what we call our extreme tsunami mitigation area, and develop return intervals of about 1,500 years for those. So what will happen is when the earthquake occurs and tsunami warning is issued for Hawaii, is that the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, based on modeling or based on the potential source, might step it up to the extreme evacuation zone, which is represented by the yellow in that map graphic that you see. So this greatly expands the size of the evacuation area, not just in Waikiki, but across all of the islands. In fact, that potential Aleutian event is in the area of the arc where much of the energy gets aimed directly at Hawaii. And it's not just extensive in Oahu, but statewide. All the islands will have catastrophic impacts. All the shallow water harbors will be severely damaged. And we're looking at 25, 30 meters of total run-up for these particular events. So they're definitely the worst case scenarios, and we've done modeling for this, but we think the return interval is much longer than these recent historic events. So that's going to be important for us to consider in terms of what we do. In terms of the next step, I want to talk a little bit about annualized losses and the applications for annualized losses. So an annual loss gives us the average losses across a given year, and that's very important for investment decisions. What's cost effective to spend each year on tsunami mitigation, for example. And so we use these 3 event periods to get us an idea of what annualized losses might be for tsunami. So it gives you the idea of how much we should be investing in mitigating the tsunami threat. It also gives us the opportunity to compare it to other perils, like how high is the tsunami risk compared to the hurricane wind risk or the coastal flood risk. And I'll talk about those examples. The 3,500 year or this design level event is very important for our building design community. The American Society of Civil Engineers put out this wonderful tool, and it provides the run-up height as well as the offshore amplitude. And the designers implement what's called the energy grade line equation, and they put these transects across any proposed buildings that they're building, and then they can calculate or estimate the force of the tsunami at that building. And so it's used in the United States to design vertical evacuation structures, essential facilities, and significant buildings. Not all buildings need to consider this, or is it applied to single family residential or anything like that. It's only applied to essential facilities and significant buildings, but this tool is readily available for the engineering community to use online, and we use this in our annualized for the 3,500 year. So on the island of Oahu, or it's called Honolulu County, we get over 40 billion in economic losses for this event. And these extreme events also expose a lot more essential facilities to the threat. So that's an important consideration. And then in terms of the population exposed day and night, you can see there's a significant increase for the daytime population because we have a lot of people that are going into harm's way. They're working in restaurants locally. They're in areas, they're at the beach communities, they're working in hotels that are all there in harm's way in Waikiki and other areas. So that's why you get this big extreme difference between night and day populations. The 1,500 year event, that's about 20 billion in losses. Also about 300,000 people exposed during the day, and still significant essential facility building losses. So with these data, we're able to support decision makers and planners in their ability to start to mitigate hazards. So as I mentioned, the mapping that's based on those 5 historic events that all occurred within an 18-year time frame, it's very uncertain to assign a time interval to that, but we do have paleo tsunami studies in Hawaii. We lack a lot of good deposition or good geologic deposition record in Hawaii because we have a lot of erosion over time. We have basically one rock type in terms of basalt. Every island is made out of basalt. So we only very localized have these depositions that we can use. And those show to us a very limited record. We have just those a few of the more recent historic events in the Paleo tsunami record, and then just one other event, the tsunami deposit from an extreme event at around 1350. So based on this, we're conservatively thinking that our standard evacuation zone represents what we call the 400-year tsunami. So as I mentioned, a lot of uncertainty in terms of if it's a 400-year or 200-year, but we conservatively are calling it the 400-year. And based on these return intervals, we're able to use, it's called the random center point method. It's in the HAZUS technical methodology, but it provides the capability to take return period data and annualize that. You're computing the area under the curve to get these annualized losses. And our annualized losses for Honolulu County from these studies is around in the $80 million a year range. So it gives you kind of a ballpark of what we can cost effectively invest in mitigation annually. And we've broken it out for government facilities, we've broken it out for schools in order to provide that kind of cost-effective target for mitigation of the tsunami threat. And then it also provides that capability, as I mentioned, to compare it to other perils. So we're able to compare it to the wind peril in Hawaii. We have a major threat. We've been very, very lucky, but we have a major threat from hurricanes, obviously. And with our topography and the ability of the topography to speed up the wind speeds, that turns out to be our highest peril in terms of losses. But tsunami is number 2. It's 2 times greater than coastal flooding, which impacts us every year. We have losses every year from coastal flooding, but they're on the average of, the $1 million, $2 million range. Whereas once we get hit by this big tsunami, the losses skyrocket. So this ability to annualize the losses is very important for these threats that are high consequence but rare events. Okay. And we've also annualized our casualties for this is for Honolulu. This was to apply for a grant to get new signs, new tsunami warning signs for Honolulu County, and it was used in figuring out our cost effectiveness for providing better education. So we think our response level or preparedness level in Hawaii is good. It's that good category that I was talking about. But if we don't have the signage, if we don't have the education, if we don't have the monthly drill, we would be in the fair category. So the idea behind these numbers is that if we didn't get the grant funding from the federal government to do the education, to do the signage, to install the sirens, and if we didn't have the programs to exercise and to do those monthly drills, we would be at this lower level of preparedness. And these could be our potential annualized losses for fatality and injury if we were at this lower level of preparedness. And that shows the benefit on an annual basis of reducing fatalities and injuries for us to get to this good level. I have just a couple more slides. I'm a little uncertain on time because we didn't start at the right time, so I don't know if I have more time or we need to target the 30 minutes, but I have about 4 or 5 more slides to show. We have tsunami essential facility losses broken out by type. And it turns out, as I mentioned, we have very little exposure to that standard evacuation zone of essential facilities. So a lot of good land use decisions were made early on in not building in those kind of historically vulnerable areas. But our vast majority of essential facilities exposed to these tsunami threats are schools, followed by government, buildings, and then we have a small sliver of our hospitals and our other emergency response, our police and fire stations exposed to these more extreme events. Then I have a couple slides about our local tsunami hazard threat in Hawaii. So we're very lucky in Hawaii. We don't have this major subduction zone with huge potential for huge local earthquakes and local tsunamis with only a few minutes warning. But we do have the Big Island of Hawaii, and it has a very active volcanic center, and it's had historic local tsunamis, including in 1975 and 1868, where we had fatalities on what's called the south flank of the Big Island. So it's based on how those will in particular rupture, but most of the energy actually moves away from the island. We'll have locally up to 16 meters of run-up along that south flank area, but it's very sparsely populated. But that wasn't the case in 1868. You can see that we have 47 fatalities in 1868, and that was from a local 7.9 earthquake and a local landslide. We had a number of fishing villages at the time on the south flank of the Big Island, and those did not repopulate after 1868. And in 1975, we had a very similar event, and there were only, even though the populations are larger, in harm's way, there were only 2 fatalities, and those were campers that were in the area. Circled in the red there is Hilo, and that's the concern, that within about 15 or 20 minutes is tsunami inundation from these events can reach Hilo. And even at that good preparedness level, we have issues with casualties, even at that good preparedness level, because it arrives so quickly and there's very little time to react. So our assumption is that earthquake ground shaking is going to provide the warning, and people are going to start reacting and evacuating when that earthquake ground shaking occurs. And provide that capability. So, this is, as I mentioned, we have the ability in local earthquakes to combine earthquake damage with tsunami damage. And even though this is a very rural area of Hawaii, we get about 1.7 billion in economic losses to buildings. And then, as I mentioned, our threat that even if the community can react quickly, you might still see fatalities and injuries because of this local event. I just have 2 more slides to finalize with. One is to announce kind of a big transition that we're making at the hazards program. We've been, for the last 20 years, on Esri's ArcGIS platform, which requires users to go out there and purchase Esri software. It's not a problem for GIS communities. Often universities have licenses for Esri's ArcGIS platform, but it is a problem for other users. So we've migrated to open source tools. We've pushed a number of those to GitHub already, but they're simpler to use. They can be edited by others, and we can leverage improvements that others provide. But those are all available under our GitHub link here. And then I also share our course materials. So we have training manuals, including presentations, exercises, and everything available in our self-guided course materials. And then extensive user and technical manuals for earthquake, for tsunami, for hurricane, and for flood. Very extensive user manuals that can be used by the global community. We have a series of YouTube videos that walk through the trainings. And then, as I mentioned, we have our GitHub releases, which will only grow going forward. These are open source tools. They're mostly written in Python. We may use other languages, R and others, but Python is a very understandable, easy to use language that the research and engineering communities are already using, and we're releasing our tools and our capabilities using Python coding. So is about it in closing. I just have the final slide. And that's it.
Excellent, excellent.
Sure. I hope I didn't take too long.
Thank you very much, Doug. This was a really excellent presentation of that, what you do there. By myself, I mean, I'm waiting through the Facebook Live session, the one or the consult or question about your talk and the theme about your talk. But before this, I may tell you that I have more than 12, 13, 14 articles about tsunamis, mainly what is going on here in Ecuador. And that what you show is, of course, often the tools of that what we use in order to show to the people what can be done in order to have a certain kind of mitigation of the impact of tsunamis. What I was slightly missing was you have shown different kinds of recurrencies of different kind of impact severities of tsunamis, like from the Aleutians and stuff like this. What you missed, of course, you didn't miss it in a certain way because it's a very rare phenomena, is when a flank collapses. I mean, these mega tsunamis, which we call also iminamis, these what have been mapped around the Hawaiian Islands, what we have in Norwega, and in other similar geotectonic settings. And we have them also in Galapagos. We have, for example, a volcano, a shield volcano called Ecuador, like the country, because the Ecuadorian line crosses there, has been bisected. Half of the volcano is in the sea, and this happened between 60 and 100,000 years. So this kind of phenomena, as many people do not really appreciate them as being that recurrent, they are really very recurrent if you see the geological records. In this respect, first of all, head down, an excellent talk, fantastic material. Thank you for this offer, as I can see, about the open sources, the open source hazes, which can be used by the ArcGIS platform as an open source tool. This will for sure be used here in Ecuador by many, many scientists as we work with tsunamis. Therefore, maybe your comment about this mega tsunamis, maybe something for the people here who listen to us?
Yes. Let me share. I'm still not on mute. Yeah. So we also, as you know, the South Flank, and I showed in that one, local screenshot, the entire South Flank of the Hawaiian Islands can actually move off and produce a mega tsunami. Those are larger timeframes. What I talked about today mostly is kind of shorter timeframe event.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
As I said, I said you didn't miss it because you know it. Of
Right.
course, you have shown that what is more likely to happen. What we know also by testimonies by different people and historic documents. What I may tell you too is that our last paper was dealing about the seismic and tsunami resistance of buildings in different touristic resorts in Ecuador, usually skyscrapers, which could be used as a temporal vertical evacuation shelter. And this is based on your manuals. What we do is we take the FEMA, and the last one I think was 1 or 2 years ago published. I can check in my paper. It was published this year in February. And I can tell you, of course, these are things which is the example for all the world. I know that other countries like Japan and Chile have to face more likely and more frequently tsunamis, but the manuals come from you guys, and we are very happy about those.
Great. Yeah, please share your paper. I would love to see it. And as you know, that's our major issue in Waikiki and in the other islands as well, is that we have such a crowded area that we did some, we had a warning from a Chilean earthquake just a few years ago, and it just created a traffic jam in Waikiki, and it put more people in harm's way. So our big push is that vertical evacuation, going up into buildings that we feel are safe, and then provide that mitigation. But yeah, very excited to see. And I think that's throughout all of the hazardous methodologies that we've developed. It's out there, it's transparent. We've tried to document it as well as possible. We also do a lot with calibration when actual events occur, and we'll go out and make adjustments to it. So in our earthquake methodology, for example, we have adjusted every single fragility function based on input from recent earthquakes. And so that methodology will always be open and shared and developed by experts in the US and shared with everybody.
In this respect, we would like, of course, to share also with you our experiences we have had by the 11th of March 2011 tsunami from Japan, which did not hit that much Hawaii, but did the Galapagos. So this was a big mistake by many authorities, including our previous president, who were calculating, Japan is so far away, and if Hawaii is not hit that much, and of course he didn't know about the low tide, then Galapagos will be hit even less. But we have had the damages up to 6 meters and 11 centimeters. And these are things which can only be shared by experts, through experts. And the experts, of course, they need, of course, the attention of the authorities in order to get through to tell, it's not that logical as you think, because there's a science behind it. Doug, I may interrupt a little bit. Please stay tuned. Many people asked me to make a short summary of your speech in Spanish so they can ask a little bit more about it, what you did. Please stay tuned.
Okay.
Queridos compañeros y compañeras, que hemos visto aquí es realmente espectacular. Como tal vez han escuchado o tal vez han entendido que dije yo sobre mis estudios propios, yo tengo 2, 13, 14, tal vez 15 artículos sobre tsunamis que hemos desarrollado en los últimos menos de 10 años con mucha gente que trabaja con nosotros en Puerto Viejo, en Manta y otros sitios del país, en vulnerabilidad, de mitigación, en la sismo y tsunami de esencia de rasgacielos. Son trabajos pioneros aquí en el Ecuador que son justamente basados en esto que dice Douglas Bausch. Douglas Bausch es uno de los pioneros de enseñar qué hay que hacer para que la población costera pueda ser más tranquila. Cuando la gente simplemente quiere venir y vivir cerca de la playa, que pueda hacerlo, pero con cierta forma de atención a la prevención, a la mitigación, a la resiliencia. Y él que ha enseñado aquí es justamente esto. ¿Qué se hace a través de Estados Unidos, a través de la FEMA, que es la Secretaría de Riesgos de Estados Unidos, para que nosotros en todo el mundo podemos aprovechar esas experiencias, estos manuales, esas herramientas y aplicarlas aquí mismo en nuestros países que somos alrededor del Pacífico y otros sitios donde puede impactarse un tsunami? Como podrían ver, Hawái mismo, las islas de Hawái también estaban varias veces impactadas a través de varios tsunamis. Hay documentos históricos, hay cálculos, simulaciones numéricas y demás que enseñan qué puede pasar allá. Y como podrían ver, las cifras son increíbles de los daños económicos que pueden ocurrir y de esto que obviamente invierten para que esto justamente no pase. En ese sentido, esto más o menos era la forma reducida, resumida de lo que dice Douglas Bausch, un experto mundial en su área, que con gusto le invitaríamos aquí para que vea qué pasó con el gran tsunami de Japón de 11 de marzo de 2011 en las islas de Galápagos, mientras que no pasó casi nada en Hawái y las autoridades aquí dijeron que no pasa nada en Hawái, mucho menos pasa en Galápagos, y era exactamente lo contrario, justamente para marea baja allá y marea alta aquí. Teníamos daños hasta 6 metros, 11 centímetros y algunos daños también en la costa ecuatoriana. Por favor, si tienen alguna pregunta, alguna consulta, ahora es la oportunidad. Aquí tienen un experto mundial. Aprovechen. Let's wait a second. Let's see what people will write or ask. And then we may ask you about those. I hear myself because I'm in Zoom and also in Facebook Live, so it takes a little bit of time to get this through. Now it's through. Let's wait. So you are stationed in in Hawaii, I guess.
Yeah, I live and work in Maui. And one time I worked with Carlos at the Pacific Disaster Center. And so that's how we met. But before I came to Maui, I was 14 years at FEMA and did a lot of work in terms of modeling real world actual events.
Well, once again, I mean, you are not a complete tsunami expert if you don't visit the Galapagos Islands.
Yes, I'm amazed 6 meters in 2011. I'm shocked that it was 6 meters.
6 meters 11. Yeah, we have reports about this. Many things which happen in Ecuador are landing in a technical report, not likely in a scientific article. And this is the big manco in a country like ours. But that doesn't mean that we are not doing any kind of work. We do. And again, I mean, I have 12, 13, 14 articles about that, what is going on here, and a little bit about the Galapagos. And once again, you are very welcome here. We have here a comment from Carlos himself. He says, just a comment, we are preparing a project of collaboration with a group of Jesus to bring Jesus to Ecuador, adapting the conditions of Ecuador, and to train the people so they can apply it. This is the comment. It's written in Spanish. I translated it right away so you know what is going on. And I think with it, it's everything said. Carlos is inviting you. Of course, you have to lead the Jesus group, and me too. And I hope to see you soon, even before the end of the pandemic. We are in such conditions that people can safely travel to Galapagos. Galapagos is the first province COVID-free. And so just come. Thank you once again a lot about your speech. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all.